The history of weapon development during the Stone Age was primarily tied to hunting, not warfare. Back then, humanity hadn't yet amassed surplus material wealth, so there was no societal class divide or strong motivation for large-scale conflicts. Although our ancestors weren't pacifists and occasional tribal skirmishes did occur, the primary purpose of weapons was hunting large herd animals. Initially, sharpened sticks and later spears with stone tips were mostly used in close combat. But over time, as Homo sapiens emerged, people realized that throwing weapons was a safer option. Throwing allowed hunters to inflict damage from a distance, reducing the risk of injury. Later, lighter spears, known as javelins, were developed along with a special tool for throwing them, a spear thrower, essentially a notched board to give extra leverage. This innovation increased range and made hunting even safer. By the Mesolithic period, during a hunting crisis, the need arose for a more versatile weapon capable of taking down smaller animals and birds. Enter the bow and a smaller projectile, the arrow. However, evidence suggests that bows had been in use in Africa much earlier. Personally, I think the bow is one of history's most cunning weapons. While modern movies often show heroes easily continuing to fight after being hit by arrows or pulling them out with a wince of pain, reality was far grimmer. Archers didn't need to kill outright. A person with an arrow stuck in their muscle became significantly less effective in combat. Even slightly moving an arrow embedded in a wound caused excruciating pain. Worse yet, arrowheads were often designed to make removal difficult. For instance, socketed arrowheads weren't firmly attached to the shaft, so when someone tried to pull out the arrow, the shaft would detach, leaving the head inside the wound. There were also broad-bladed arrows that didn't get stuck in the body but caused extensive damage. A bleeding fighter weakened quickly, often focusing more on survival than battle. When people reference the Second Lateran Council of 1139 and its ban on bows and crossbows, many see it as proof of the exceptional effectiveness of ranged weapons. In reality, as noted earlier, even without being lethal, arrows could disable enemy soldiers and their horses. After all, with a chunk of metal lodged in your leg, arm, or stomach, your agility drops dramatically. And worrying about passing out from blood loss or avoiding infection probably didn't boost morale. There were ways to make arrows even deadlier, though. And yes, we're talking about poison. Modern chemical weapons like VX gas or the Soviet A-232 Novichok are arguably humanity's most dangerous inventions. To put things into perspective, open sources suggest that the lethal dose of A-232 when ingested is just 10 micrograms. I should note that official data on these substances is scarce, so take this information with caution. But if true, a single 30-milligram drop of A232 could kill 3,000 people. 1 kilogram would poison 100 million, and 80 kilograms could wipe out all of humanity, which is now approaching 8 billion. In other words, a quantity of poison that could fit in a car trunk or even on a bike could end civilization. However, much larger doses are required for skin absorption. Still, a full drop on the skin is reportedly guaranteed to be fatal. Fortunately, humanity seemingly realized the horrifying potential of chemical weapons and adopted a convention banning their use. Moreover, such weapons lack effective delivery systems. In practice, deploying poisons in combat would require not grams or kilograms, but hundreds of kilograms or even tons of material, most of which would never reach its target. But humanity has known and used poisons since ancient times. Primitive tribes, as they survive today, show that ancient hunting involved two main approaches. The first was for a group of more than 10 hunters to surround an animal and overwhelm it with spears and javelins. This method was fast and effective. The second approach was more challenging. When one or just a few hunters participated, their goal was to wound the animal and then track it for miles, waiting for it to weaken. Determining if the injury was severe enough was often difficult. And after chasing prey across savannas, steppes, and forests for dozens of kilometers, they might end up empty-handed. According to an article by Marlise Lombard in Archaeological Science, poison-tipped javelins were already being used in Africa 60,000 years ago. While some plant residues can persist on ancient tools for thousands of years, the conclusion that poisons were used is primarily based on the structural design of the weapon tips. The use of poisoned javelins and arrows in the past is indirectly confirmed by similar practices among surviving indigenous peoples in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. For example, 17th-century explorer Walter Raleigh recorded that South American tribes used poison-tipped darts coated with curare for hunting, Just 3 to 5 drops of this poison were enough to stop the breathing of a man weighing around 100 kilograms. Meanwhile, Native Americans in North America used rattlesnake venom, often mixed with rotting liver or other unappetizing substances. This mixture caused tissue necrosis and disrupted blood clotting, making wounds from poisoned arrows excruciatingly painful and often fatal. In Africa, the Bushmen perfected the art of creating deadly poisons. Their recipe used the larvae of beetles called Diamphidia, relatives of the Colorado potato beetle. This venom quickly depletes hemoglobin in the blood. Just a few drops on an arrow could bring down a giraffe weighing about half a metric ton, although it could take days. Smaller doses often resulted in paralysis or immobility. Some of the most potent poisons in South America and Japan were derived from toxic frogs. A single arrow tipped with batrachotoxin, sourced from these amphibians, could send its target to the afterlife in under 10 minutes. But here's the big question: why poison something you plan to eat? Turns out the poisons used in hunting were often selected because their concentration in the meat ended up being too low to harm humans, or because they broke down into harmless compounds when cooked. Poisoned arrows were likely used in warfare too, as suggested by ancient Greek epics. Think of Hercules and his arrows dipped in the venom of the Lernaean hydra, or Odysseus seeking out deadly plants for his weapons. Descriptions of Scythians who were particularly fond of their bows are practically dripping with mentions of poisons in ancient texts. Writers like Lucian of Samosata, Pliny the Elder, Ovid, and others all touched on the subject. However, accounts of the poisons themselves vary. Some texts, like one from a student of Aristotle, describe bizarre mixtures of rotten flesh, blood, and dung. Ovid, on the other hand, mentions snake venom. Scythian arrowheads were small bronze creations. A university professor once explained that bronze reacts with blood in horrifying ways, either oxidizing it or more likely causing infection. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a source to confirm this. In Asia, there's also a tradition of making poisons from the sap of the upas tree. Heated over an open flame, the sap became a potent toxin capable of causing paralysis and, within 5 to 30 minutes, heart failure. Overall, it seems that while nature doesn't provide many substances capable of outright killing through a wound, humans have been finding ways to weaponize toxins since the Stone Age. In medieval Europe, however, poisoned arrows were rare, despite the nobility's known fondness for other poisons. Several factors explain this. First, archers were often from lower social classes, and their weapons were made cheaply. Arrowheads were sometimes poor-quality metal or even bone, which remained in use until the late Middle Ages. Arrows often lacked fletching, and archers primarily fired in volleys to wound horses or poorly armored enemies. Producing effective poisons on an industrial scale was difficult and expensive. Second, Europe, aside from Antarctica, is the poorest continent in terms of venomous flora and fauna. Third, if a poison didn't act quickly, killing the target in mere minutes, there was a cheaper alternative. Since ancient times, archers during battle would stick their arrows into the ground, where all sorts of microbes would contaminate the tips. This dramatically increased the chances of wound infections and blood poisoning in their victims. Another simple yet effective method was to jab arrows into the carcasses of dead animals or, well, into less savory waste. Feudal lords, those medieval tanks on horseback, weren't too keen on archers and crossbows even before plate armor came around. Poisoned arrows? Not on their watch. The church's attempts to ban bows and crossbows? Yeah, just the feudal lords protecting their interests. All of this, combined with other factors, meant poisoned arrows were a rarity in medieval Europe. Nobles and monarchs died of poisons in their goblets, while common folk had to settle for infected wounds and gangrene.